It's interesting.
Well, welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 361st meeting since we started in February 2009. We put a speaker on every week, a different subject. We require our speaker to take a position on an issue or express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. We give an hour to make a presentation. If they go over an hour, we cut them off. If anybody interrupts the speaker, remind the interrupter we'll listen only one fool at a time. It's one of our rules. Then we have questions and answers from the audience, not speeches. Then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in the audience that wants to gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond to what the speaker said for or against. And our speaker gets the last word, gets a comment, to close the meeting. That's how it works. But before we introduce our speakers, we have announcements. Any announcements? Now's the time for announcements. Jim, you have an announcement. Come on up here. Yeah, come on up here, Susan. When you get.
You want to let Susan go first?
You want to go first or second?
Why don't you go first?
Yeah, she'll go first.
Well, she's welcome to.
I'll make it quick.
All right.
I won't be as quick.
It will be fast. Hi, we wanted to let everyone know that Margaret's husband has died. Okay, Grover Gillette, did I say his name? Yeah. And there's going to be a memorial for him in June, I understand. But I guess this just happened. And there also is going to be a great program of like music from Turkey and Morocco tomorrow night at SMU at Greer Garson, is that
Theater,
it? Theater,
yeah.
at 7:30, and it's free, Sunday night. Okay, Sunday night.
Do you know what time it is?
7:30?
7:30, Greer Garson? Okay.
I never heard of
That's
that.
on the, Greer Garson's on the other side of SMU that's over there, where the,
Is it in the art building?
yes, it's in the art building. The art and Peru.
Well, good evening, guys. I know you're out there getting some more information out of Susan. I'll say just a couple of words about Grover. Grover was a PhD. He taught accounting and business down at the original Dallas County Community College, El Centro, downtown in what was the old Sanger Brothers department store. And he was quite a man. I thought a lot of him. I served on an accounting advisory committee down there for over 25 years. I've lost track of the time. One of my best friends was also a professor there and talked me into coming down and doing it, and I liked it. Always enjoyed education. In fact, my wife would tell me every so often I ought to go back to school and teach. I said, no, it's too late in life. I'm not going to do that. So I stayed in my accounting profession and made a good time of it. But Grover was very dear to us, and we'll miss him. We could see he was getting quite frail in his past, his last few trips here, and was having a hard time getting around. It's always sad to see. He was nothing like that when I first met him, so a lot of you never saw him in his earlier years, which I had the privilege of doing. But we'll miss him, and we wish well to his wife in his absence. She'll miss him more than anyone. I want to say just a couple of words as a prelude to our presentation tonight. I would really encourage you to listen to our speaker tonight. You'll get one of the best history lessons on what the Dallas-Fort Worth petroleum and business community of large privately owned businesses is in this metropolitan area. We're very fortunate. I was very fortunate when I finished my accounting degree in '65. I went to work for a CPA firm, and we had a lot of those people as clients. So I got acquainted with them and was going to the petroleum club and the engineering club here in Dallas at an early age. Met an awful lot of those people. A lot of the old time initial founders of the oil fields in East Texas and out in the Permian Basin were still alive and active and coming to meetings. And so as a very young person, wow, I mean, you really had a privilege of being around and learning things just from the conversations with or just being at the next table, from some of these neat people. So I was really looking forward to our meeting tonight. But Sid Richardson was one of the important ones. The Cullen Davis family in Fort Worth, the Burnett's. You move over to Dallas, everybody's heard of H.L. Hunt and his 3 generation of families. The Murchisons, Ed Cox, Jake Hammond. The 2 biggest geology and petroleum engineering firms were based right here in Dallas. The geology firm was DeGolyer McNaughton. And if you've been to the beautiful park on Garland Road that fronts out onto the lake, that's his mansion that he built in the 1930s, and then the camp estate next door. So what we're hearing tonight is some history that people in the younger generations don't know much or anything perhaps about than some of us who have a few years on our odometer. And since our speaker has taken the time and effort to go through and write a book, I would tell you he has to know a lot about it. So my rhetoric is just basically saying, this is going to be good, guys. Listen up. You'll learn something you might never have learned anywhere else.
Oh, yeah. It was a great introduction. Anyway, on the question of one of the quotes I had from Grover, I remember, was that he always said that he hoped everything wore out at the same time. So one of his quotes. And I never forget that. Anyway, it's when I think of him, I think of that quote. But our speaker next week is April 20 or May 8th, April 29th. This place will be moving. It's on the itinerary here. They're moving to 7033 Greenville Avenue, which is south of here. It's on the west side of the street. So it's right now it's Frank's Taco Place or something, but it'll be Roma's when they get through with it. And I guess it has the same square footage inside, but it doesn't have the outdoor area. So and the room that we have is a little bit narrower than this one by about a foot, and it's about a third shorter. So but there's room to go out. So anyway, just so you know, next week there'll be no meeting because of their moving. And May 6th is our next open meeting, and we have a speaker kind of lined up. I'm hoping to get him soon. And May 13th, the drug war, how we got in this mess, how invested interest to keep us here. That's Suzanne Wills. And May 20th is Catherine Savers McGovern. She's a retired assistant U.S. attorney. She'll be our speaker here. And that's on your itinerary also. I'm not going to read all this, put you to sleep. Anyway, our speaker tonight is Jim Gatewood. He's a Dallas history professor and best-selling Dallas author. He's spoke here before. He's a writer of several books about Dallas history. He'll discuss and review his latest book, Sid Richardson and Texas Oil. Jim will show and outline ramifications on resolving the question of rags to riches. He'll also bring books for those who wish to purchase same. He's there in the back of the room. He told me that. Anyway, without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to Jim Gatewood.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that introduction. I may have to take you with me on a few trips. Sid Richardson was a very private person. He never got married. There's a reason for that we'll unspool on downstream. Now, the only way that a book could be written, there are just little facets of history here and there, and you have to connect that with your imagination. But the past 11 years, as I speak to Rotary clubs, service club, churches, chambers of commerce, and so forth, I announced that there is a book in the pipeline about Sid Richardson. And people have come forward and given me stories, and I've been able to pretty well put this together. Now, Sid Richardson was born right down here in Athens, Texas, about 60 or 70 miles down the road. He was the first child of a 7-child family. He was a big, robust boy at a time when it was more important to be strong and a good worker than it was to be educated. In fact, education was looked on as kind of being sissified. Now, we're talking about the turn of the century. And parents raised field hands. They didn't raise children. Now, no one knows how much money changed hands when oil was first discovered in Texas. It was astonishing to the world that 6 oil wells in the state of Texas could produce more oil than the entire world. And Sid Richardson was a young, ambitious boy, intelligent, whose intelligence and ambition collided with opportunity. Now, as a young man, he traded cattle and was able to get ahead, and he enrolled at Baylor University. And here he met a girl by the name of Annie Jo. Annie Jo spotted him in chapel and made arrangements with friends and got a blind date. After about 3 or 4 weeks of courtship, it was becoming quite torrid. Annie Jo's parents were out of town, and she invited him into the parlor. He came into the parlor, and the courting was so passionate that she pushed him away and said, "Sid, do you love me enough to marry me?" I'm sure some of you guys have been in that spot before. Anyway, he heard himself say yes. Fortunately for the young lady, her parents came home just about that time. The back door slammed and Sid scooted out the front door. Now, he can't sleep that night. He's tossing and turning. Of course, he wants this girl, but the obligation of marriage is scaring him to death, and he's weighing and calculating. But early the next morning, there's a knock on his door, and there's a Western Union telegram delivery boy there. Gives Sid a telegram telling him that his father has died, and he's to come home right away. Because of the time of the morning, and he wanted to catch the train going out of town, he simply scribbled a note and left it in Annie Jo's mailbox. He got home, and the family was destitute. Without Sid working, they would have been impoverished. So he got a job as a teamster, driving mules, a wagon pulling pipe, going from Fort Worth to Wichita Falls, because a new oil field had just been brought in up there, Electra. Now, he'd been working there. Well, first of all, I've got to tell you about him getting the job. He went to Electra with his suitcase in hand. It was a rainy day. The rain was coming down. There were tents all over everywhere, men milling around. It was a typical boomtown oil type situation. He comes up on this lady's porch, and he knocks on the door, and he wants a room. She says, "Well, we have no rooms." She says, "But it'll cost you $5 a day to sleep on my porch." He snorts and says, $5 a day? So, and she told him, she said, "Buster, this is a boomtown. You take it or leave it." So he said, "Well, all the money in the world I've got is $3. Would you take $1 till I get a job, and if you'll stake me?" And she looked at him, and he was a big guy, strong. She felt that he would have no problem getting a job, so she did stake him. Now, the next morning for breakfast, after sleeping in the rain all night, it rained that night, and the wind blew it in on the porch, and he's soaking wet. He didn't sleep much that night. There was some guys sleeping out in the yard. They had a big fight, and one roughneck nearly drowned another one, holding his face down in the mud. They had to take a pocket knife and scrape his nose out so he could get his breath. The next morning, he downed 6 eggs and a half a dozen biscuits, and he was off looking for work. Well, he didn't go far when there was a wagon stuck in the mud. And there was a man sitting on the buckboard seat. He was sleeping. And Sid asked him if he could get a ride to the oil patch. The man woke up and he said, "Can't you see this wagon stuck?" And he said, "Well, it seems to be." And the man on the wagon told him, he said, "I hired a fellow from Canada to drive these mules and he's left me, the wagon's stuck. I shouldn't have trusted anybody from Canada anyway. Can you drive a team of mules?" Sid said, "I sure can," and he vaulted up into the seat. There was one of those black snake whips there, and he threw that in a circle and it popped right between the mule's ears like a .45 going off, and they jerked that wagon out. And the man on the buckboard said, "You not only got a ride, you've got a job, son, if you want it." So he got his job. Now they went to a cafe at noon that day to get their lunch, the only cafe available, and they had to stand in line. And finally, they got to where they can order. Sid's throat is sore. He caught cold, of course, sleeping on that porch and getting wet. So he asked the Greek proprietor for a bowl of soup. The Greek proprietor went back into the kitchen and he shoved a bowl of chili across there. Sid said, "I wanted soup." The Greek said, "Eat chili like a man, don't be a sissy." And Sid shoved the chili back and said, "I want soup." The Greek shoved it back to him, so Sid just picked the bowl up and threw it and hit the Greek. Of course, chili's all over him. The Greek's angry. There's a counter between him and Sid. He vaults over the counter, and right as he's in midair, Sid greets him with a good stiff right hand, knocks him back on the stove and burns his hand. Well, the Greek called Sid several unsavory names and came out from behind the meat counter with a cleaver in his hand after Sid. Well, Sid struck him again and he dropped the meat cleaver, and the fight continued on out into the yard there. And these two men are fighting, and they fought for about an hour. Sid has knocked the man down and he's in a mud puddle. So he goes over and he extends his hand to help him up. Now, while he's helping him up, he takes a knife out of his boot. He presses the knife against the man's stomach so nobody else can see it and says, "If you don't capitulate and get this damn foolishness over with, I'm going to open you up and see what you had for breakfast." Well, the Greek capitulated and Sid got his soup. And these two men, later on, every time Sid came in there, they would cuss each other out real well, but they were friends. Now, Sid liked to go to the Westbrook Hotel on the weekends when he wasn't working, because there on the mezzanine floor, the oil people gathered and they were selling and trading their oil properties. And they'd hold their properties in the hand and shout how many acres, the price per acre, the nearest production, and so forth. One man actually had one of those signs on like you see selling sandwiches, only he had several different lease locations on there. It's kind of like the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Sid is fascinated and he wants to get in on this, but of course he has no money. Then he sees a Baylor classmate of his there, a fellow by the name of Otis Denton, who's got a patch over one eye. Otis has got a group of men around him. He finishes his business, they disperse. He sees Sid and he motions for him to come over. Sid comes over and Otis reaches into his coat pocket and he takes out a pad of papers and he said, "Now Sid, these are Texas Standard Mineral lease papers." He says, "What you do," he said, "you fill out the farmer's name up here, you give the legal description of the property here, what county, how many acres, and so forth. The terms and conditions of your lease you fill in down here, and the farmer signs it here and you witness it. Now Sid, you tell that farmer anything to get him to sign that lease, because you can bring it back here to the Westbrook Hotel and sell it for many times more than what you paid for it." This is exactly what Sid Richardson wanted to do. He took those papers home that night, he got out his dictionary and he studied it. He got his vocabulary in order, and the next morning, which is a Sunday morning, he's bouncing out across the prairie in his Model T Ford. Now the first 5 farmers he calls on have already sold their lease, but the 6th one has not sold his lease. And the reason he has not sold his lease is because he is demanding that a well be drilled within 30 days after the date of the lease. Now Sid knows that it takes $50,000 to go down to the depth where the oil is. And he hasn't got $50,000. He doesn't even know anybody that's got $50,000. So he's sort of in a trance there. He's suspended. He doesn't know what to do. Then he remembers what Otis Denton told him. He said, "Tell that man anything to get him to sign that lease." So Sid agreed to drill the well within 30 days. And the farmer signed the lease. Sid gave him a check for $100 because it was 100 acres, $1 an acre for the lease. Now Sid is bouncing back across the prairie towards the Westbrook Hotel. He said, I felt like the dog that had chased the car and caught it. I didn't know what to do with it. He said, I was feeling lower and lower. I got to the Westbrook Hotel, and there's the usual confusion, and at that time and that day, if there were a seat, you'd take it, and you'd introduce yourself around the table. There was one chair available, and he took it, sat down, introduced himself. The waiter came up, and he ordered just coffee. He'd lost his appetite. He said, I felt so low. He said, in addition to not knowing what to do, I'd given that farmer a check for $100, and I only had $51 in the bank. He said, I was sitting there feeling sorry for myself and remembering that the newspaper in Athens had very little to write about, and that if I was put in jail and if there was a trial, and if I was sent to jail, this would be headline in the Athens newspaper, which would embarrass my good Baptist family. I was sitting there feeling sorry for myself, and this great big robust guy wearing a leather jacket and a white Stetson walks up, puts his hands on the table and leans in and says, does anybody here know Sid Richardson? He thought, my God, it's a Texas Ranger. They've already figured out I'm overdrawn at the bank. But the man sticks out his hand and he says, Sid says, I'm Sid Richardson. He figured he might as well take his medicine and get it over with. The other man stuck out his hand and said, my name is Dick Griffin, son, and I'm with the Hog Creek Oil Company. And the reason I'm looking for you is because that farmer whose lease you got, I was there 15 minutes after you left. And I want to buy that lease. Sid is stunned, and that East Texas mind is sort of clicking there. And he says, well, Mr. Griffin, what do you think that lease is worth? Dick Griffin told him, he said, son, I'll pay you $40,000 cash for it right now. Sid is stunned again. But that mind is clicking. And he said, Mr. Griffin, he said, I tell you what I'll do. He said, you guarantee to drill a well within 30 days, pay me $50,000, and give me an 1/8 override, and you got a deal. He stuck out his hand. Dick Griffin took it. Now we know that Sid Richardson had his foot on the first rung of that ladder that carried him to such great success. Now as a result of this, of course, he was anxious and he went all in. By that I mean at that time that cash was scarce. He's got $50,000. The drillers are going out and drilling the wells for an 1/8 interest. And he can buy that 1/8 interest with all that cash he's got. So he spends it all betting on. And he doesn't get any production, and he's broke. Now, he's been living in the Texas Hotel, at the penthouse. And he says, I sort of went from the penthouse to the outhouse. But what he did, he had been frequenting a place in Arlington, Texas called the Top of the Hill Casino. And I don't know whether I've reviewed that book, that book for you or not, but I've written a book about that casino, and we'll do that later, Tom. Anyhow, Top of the Hill Casino in that day was the most opulent casino in the Northern Hemisphere on a 37-acre campus there in Arlington. The Arlington Baptist College bought the property, and today the Arlington Baptist College is on that same 37 acres, and you can go there and tour the place. And in the cafeteria, which used to be the casino, over in the corner, the old escape tunnel is still there. Now, Sid frequented this place, and the owner and the fellow that built it, Fred Browning, called Sid aside. And he said, Sid, I have a proposition for you. I would like for you to stay out here and live with us and be available, because what happens to us, these Texas oil men hit it rich, and any Texas oil man worth his salt will come into a casino with breaking the casino in mind. And they get on the crap table and they lose all their money. Then they come out with these oil papers and they put them on the table and they want to shoot for that. And we have no idea what those are worth. Now we'll give you a little office back here. And when this happens, we'll bring these papers back to you and you can tell us how much we can allow the oil man to have as credit. So Sid took this job. Now as a result of this, he and Fred Browning, the owner of the casino, had some oil activities together. I reviewed the Texas oil journals and found several wells where they were partners. Now, in the meantime, Clint Murchison has got out of the service, And Sid gets hold of him and tells him that this is the opportunity to go into the oil patch. And Sid is able to get started again. You see, Clint's father owns the bank in Athens, Texas, and they get a little front-running money. We move on downstream, and it's about 6 years later, and the bank in Fort Worth, First National Bank in Fort Worth, Texas, is horrified. They've got over $1 million loaned to Sid Richardson. He can't pay the interest on the loan. The property that is collateral, there's no production, and they don't know how they're going to get around this. When a young banker by the name of David Kettlecamp has an idea, he says, what we need to do is find a partner for Sid Richardson who is rich enough so that if they get a partnership, that will make the loan look a lot better on our bank's records. Oh, thank you so much. So this comes to pass. Now, in the meantime, Sid is flat broke, and he has made a friend out of Amon Carter, the mayor of Fort Worth. You see, he sees Amon Carter come into the barber shop there at the Texas Hotel. The barber shop's on the ground floor, and here's this prosperous-looking man comes in every Saturday morning. He has his hair cut, his fingernails done, and somebody shining his shoes. So he inquires, who is that man? And of course the barber said, well, that's Amon Carter. He owns the Star-Telegram newspaper. So Sid Richardson stalks Amon Carter and propositions him. He said, look, I'm a gambler. I'm having a bad run of cards, but they'll turn. What I need is $1,000 loan. And I'll either pay you back the $1,000 at the end of the week, or you can have half my winnings. Amon, a gambler himself, liked Sid's candor, and he loaned him the $1,000. Sid did well. The $1,000 was paid back, and to make a long story short, the two men became partners. Now, right after the Civil War, a fellow by the name of Tom Johnson and his wife Amanda, their 9 children and 50 cattle, he owned 50 head of cattle, decided that they would move from Denison, Texas. And they started moving south, and with their 50 head of cattle, and they got 2 oxen pulling their wagon, they crossed the Brazos River, and lightning strikes and kills their oxen. So they decide, well, this is a beautiful country. They're in Palo Pinto County. They said, we'll just build our home here, and they did. But they had to go 4 miles to the Brazos River to get their water. A well digger by the name of Harold Adams comes through, and he agrees to dig a well for them and guarantees water in return for a team of mules. The well is dug, and they don't like the water. It tastes sort of strange, and they're afraid it may be poison. But they've got to go 4 miles to the river to get their water, so they start sampling the water, and sure enough, it's palatable and nobody gets sick. So they decide instead of the strange taste, they'll go ahead and drink that water. Now, both the mother and father were suffering from arthritis. And strangely enough, their arthritis went away. And John, who was in poor health and skinny, began to gain weight, and his health was much better. The word went out about this mineral water, and people began to come there, and they were selling their water for a nickel for a pint jar. And before you know it, there's over 3,000 people camped around these wells drinking their water.
Crazy crystals.
That's right. And as a result of this, a young businessman here in Dallas by the name of Carr Collins decides that he will build a hotel down there and call it the Crazy Water Hotel.
I worked for him.
Did you? I did too. I sold life insurance for him.
All right. Well, the L Union.
Yep. I should have held on to that stock and not sold it too. Anyway, Carr Collins builds a 7-story hotel, calls it the Crazy Water Hotel, and his radio has just come out. He gets on the radio and promises that this water, and he makes crystals. He distills the water, makes crystals, and sells you packages of crystals. And he's telling you over the radio that if you put these crystals in your bathtub when you take a bath, that it'll cure everything from athlete's foot to decaying teeth.
Yeah.
And he sells a bunch of it. Now, the people in Mineral Wells are somewhat concerned that he's taken all the thunder, and they contact a fellow by the name of Frank Baker who builds the Baker Hotels.
Right.
And the Baker Hotel is built, and it is an 11-story hotel and way outdoes the Crazy Crystal Hotel. In fact, they had ceiling fans in that hotel, and they copied the same architecture that they have up in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And this was the place to be, and the Brazos room in the hotel was the very finest. Will Rogers, Howard Hughes,
Yep.
all the big names came there. They had the big name bands. This was the buzz place to be. So
Exactly.
Amon Carter and Sid Richardson decide that they'll go down and check this out. And they get down there, it's a summer afternoon, and they get there in the afternoon, and they decide that instead of taking a shower, they check into the room, but instead of taking a shower, they're going to take a dip in the pool and get a little libation there while they're sunning. So they get their bathing suits on, and they're sitting there and drinking their refreshment. And Sid sees two boys, probably 4 or 5 years old, holding hands, and they're both jumping off into the deep end of the pool. But only one comes up. Without thinking about it, Sid's into the water. He's down there, and of course it's beautiful clear water. He can see the young man sitting on the bottom of the pool and bubbles coming out. So he scoops him up and takes him up to the top. Well, the grandmother, who also saw the young man jump into the pool, is quite worried, and she is so relieved that her grandson has been rescued. And she takes him and wraps a towel around him. Sid returns to his seat. He's not thinking too much about it. Amon compliments him on his deed. And about that time, there's a shadow comes over Sid, and it's the grandmother, and the mother is also there. The grandmother tells little Jimmy, he says, tell the kind man thank you. And Jimmy said, thank you. He said, my friend was going to teach me how to swim, but it didn't work, and I appreciate you saving me, or whatever he said. And the grandmother invites Sid and Amon Carter for barbecue that evening at their home. Now, Sid can't help but notice that the mother is a beautiful woman and very shapely.
Yeah.
At home that evening, he learns that she is a divorcee. They have their evening meal, and she goes out in the kitchen. Her name is Jasmine. Jasmine is out in the kitchen doing dishes, and Sid gets up and excuses himself. And he goes out and he gets a glass of water, and he reaches around Jasmine to turn the water on. Aha! And when he did, Jasmine turns around, they embrace. Well, that's as far as we'll take that story. But anyway, Sid tells Amon, he says, I'm going to stay here in Mineral Wells for a while. Said, you going back to Fort Worth or whatever you want to do. Well, it so happened that Jasmine's job, she is the superintendent for Southwestern Bell. And Southwestern Bell has got their West Texas terminal in a sub-basement in the Baker Hotel. Now, Sid has been in an all-night poker game. He loves to play poker, and the higher the stakes, the better he likes it. And he's taking a nap one afternoon, and the phone rings. And it's Jasmine on the phone. She says, oh, Mr. Richardson. She said, Donald Scoggins with the Gulf Oil Company is calling the home office in Pittsburgh. Would you like to listen in? Well, certainly he would, and he listened in, and what he learned was that Gulf Oil in the Permian Basin had 10-year leases that were expiring, and they either had to drill these leases or forfeit their lease, let it go. So listening to the telephone call, he learned that Gulf Oil is going to have a massive drilling exploration in the Permian Basin. Armed with this information, he rushes back to Dallas. Now, meantime, David Kettlecamp, the banker, has found a partner for Sid Richardson. And money is no problem, and they agree it's a 50-50 deal. Sid rushes back to the Permian Basin and starts leasing land. In fact, he can buy land for the same price that you'd pay for a lease. Those of you familiar with that part of Texas, you know that there's nothing but sand, tumbleweed, and some cactus.
That's right.
Boy, it is a tough place to imagine how anyone would make a living out there. But anyway, he acquires 6 ranches that he owns outright, and I don't know how many acres of land. Well, of course, Gulf Oil's wells comes in, Sid's wells come in. Incidentally, Amon Carter followed along. He was a partner in a lot of the stuff. And Amon Carter, before he died, sold his interest in the Permian Basin for $60 million to Shell Oil Company. And even that flamboyant mayor couldn't spend all that money before he died. But that is the Sid Richardson story, and of course he never got over the girl, Annie Jo, but he never married anyone else. I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Well, tell us about the nephews.
About who?
The nephews. Bass brothers.
Well, John Conley made out Sid's will. Sid left everything to charity. And Conley said, well, he said, Sid, you really ought to leave a little money to your nephews. See, his younger sister, Ann Bass, married Perry Bass, a doctor in, the doctor actually was in Mineral Wells when Sid almost lost his leg and the doctor was able to sell it. But anyhow, he did leave each one of his nephews $3 million, which was a paltry sum, because Sid's estate was estimated at that time to be worth over $700 million. But this is a great Texas story. It's never been published in any other book. You've got it back there at the back of the room for $20, original first edition, and I'll sign it for you. And if we don't have a film about it someday, well, maybe not in my lifetime, but they'll sure be passing up a good one. Thank you so very much. I'm going to go sit with my books now.
You have to answer.
I love the oil field stuff because I moved, my first nursing job was in Tyler, Texas. And I went to the oil museum and I thought that was just fascinating. And I met a lot of people that worked. What did most of the people think of H.L. Hunt? Like Sid Richardson, Amon Carter, the people that dealt with H.L. Hunt and the Hunt family.
I don't understand your question.
Like the Hunt family, what was, Sid Richardson and the Bass brothers, I understand about them. But all these guys were such big names. What did a lot of people think about H.L. Hunt? Sid Richardson, was he ever friends with the Hunts?
Sid Richardson loaned H.L. Hunt 25 cents to buy a hamburger when he didn't bring his cash with him one day down there in the East Texas field.
Well,
They were all friends. They played poker together. And there's a story in the book about Top of the Hill Casino where H.L. Hunt was playing poker and he lost his Cadillac that he was driving. But it was just like the boys are today at the Petroleum Club.
I have another question. I understand like Hunt and several of the other super rich oilmen hated Roosevelt, FDR, but Richards didn't, right? Richardson?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing the question.
Hello. I understand that Sid Richards, is that his last name, Richardson was friends with FDR Roosevelt, or he wasn't? Because I know most of those men hated the New Deal and they hated him, and that's why we have this ultra conservatism here in Texas, because they set the pace.
Roosevelt's oldest son was the black sheep of the family. And he left his wife, and he was taking a motor car trip across the United States looking for opportunity and a job. He stopped in Fort Worth where they were having the Fat Stock Show, and Sid Richardson was one of the judges. He loved cattle and was a cattle trader as a young man. He met young Roosevelt, and the two men became fast friends, and he helped Roosevelt buy a radio station. And as a result of that, when FDR was on his yacht, the Potomac, and he was coming down to dock at Aransas Pass, he sent an invitation to his son to go deep sea fishing with him. His son asked that if he could bring Sid and another fellow by the name of Clint Murchison along with him to go fishing with Roosevelt.
Yep.
The three men became fast friends. They tried to get Roosevelt in a poker game, but he wisely chose to say gin rummy instead. And there was a young senator that was on that trip by the name of Lyndon Johnson. He proposed that they put up a $50 pot to see who caught the biggest fish. And they got into a real run of kingfish, and Lyndon caught one that weighed 53 pounds, and he won the $250. But this was the incubation of a very powerful political group. Later on, Sid Richardson owned an island St. Joe Island and Matagorda Bay right off of Ranges Pass. He had a landing strip there, and John Conley was the conduit. The airplanes would land there and pick up bags of money to take back and bribe Congress to get oil deals that they wanted. But Roosevelt was very suspicious of the major oil companies, and because he became such a fast friend of Sid Richardson, when World War II broke out, he put Richardson in the position of being his advisor for oil. And as a result of that, Sid got a deal where the United States Navy bought all their oil in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, through his terminal at Corpus Christi. But yes, that was a very strong bond that developed and very powerful influence in our government at that time. Thank you. That was an excellent question. I'm glad you asked it.
Excuse me, I got this in my mouth. Can you tell the group, go just a step further with the nephews. Tell the group how the nephews and Richard Rainwater earned that sounds like a small gift today. It wasn't then, but it sounds small today, and each of them being billionaires.
Well, I'm not familiar with that facet of the story.
Well, I'll finish just with this little bit. One of their classmates was Richard Rainwater. And when Rainwater graduated from Harvard with one of them, he went to work for the big, high-powered two-name, and I can't say it tonight, stock brokerage firm with one of my friends. So he's remained friends with him until he died last year. So I got a lot of feedback, from the side. Rainwater was a financial genius. It was very hard to understand how he could see behind a printed financial statement and see what was actually inside a company. And he bought and sold a lot of companies, including places as big as Disney. They owned Disney for a while. So, Sid's gift, while it was not all of his estate, was taken by their classmate, Richard Rainwater, and turned them into billionaires. Of course, now they've developed Sundance Square in downtown Fort Worth. The name is on the Opera House Concert Hall downtown. They're a real core family in Fort Worth, and they haven't just made the money and taken it, but they contribute it back. So to me, that's very wonderful to see that happen in your community.
Yeah, it's Sid Richardson's money. It's responsible for the
Started it all going.
Yeah.
Seed money.
The Bass family, of course, is in control of the money that he left. But he gave his nephew, Perry Bass, when he graduated from Harvard, he gave him a job as a CEO of his company. And one of his first assignments was to build the hurricane-proof home on St. Joe Island, which he did. But I'm glad to get that information about Rainwater. If I'd had a little earlier, I'd gotten it in the book.
He wants to sit downtown.
All right, you get to sit down now.
Okay.
Okay, now it's your turn to talk. So if you want to say anything you have to say, either for or against what our speaker has talked about here tonight, come on up here. Jim, somebody?
I have something.
Well, come on up here.
Julie's book. We're not sure. Okay. This is a great book, besides your books. My husband always has books. I think this was from Julie, but I'm not sure, but I found it in my house. But I kind of remember buying it for $1, so I'm not sure. But this is a great book to read, The Big Rich, besides your book. And it kind of explains how much money was made. I mean, this state was making, in today's, it would be like zillions of dollars back in 1910. The state of Texas, which was really a very poor rural state. But this is an interesting book that I've been reading. We're not sure where I got it from. And then he's in this book. You've read this, haven't you?
It's an acknowledgement of my book.
Okay, great. I didn't know that. I'm only halfway through. Okay.
Well, thanks a lot to Jim tonight.
You might not have.
I hope you found it interesting as I did. And, you know, to me, it's always a pleasure to hear about people who are brave enough to be gamblers and wise enough to make money. It's sort of ironic, you know, when you back off and look at this family, at him, at Sid, that he in fact was a gambler, not just in his business activities, but at the table, you know. And those are very interesting people. And you know, Dallas-Fort Worth is just a spot on the prairie. It's nothing, you know, geographically. We're not on the ocean, we're not on the Gulf, we're not on a major river. We're just a spot out in the middle of the prairie. And now we have, whatever it is, 7 million people living in the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. We have a very diverse economy. I've worked all over the country, you know, East Coast and West Coast. I spent a lot of time working in Tom and Susan's Chicago. Loved it. Great city. And I like all of what I've seen here and there. But Dallas does have its Fort Worth, I included. My wife was a Fort Worth native. Was born in initial raising in Fort Worth, and have a lot of friends in Fort Worth. So I have more family attachment to it, I suppose, than most people in Dallas would. In fact, it wasn't very long ago when you could talk to people in Dallas or Fort Worth whose center of downtowns are only 30 miles apart, which is sort of nothing in today's world. But a lot of people wouldn't even go from one to the other, you know? And they have a very different personality, but when you add them all together, it's a great complementary personality. Fort Worth, of course, was on the cattle trail that went from all those South Texas farms, ranches, I should say. They're not farms. We don't call them farms because they're not digging and planting and harvesting. They're growing cattle. And the Big King Ranch, for example, down near the Gulf. That's Kingsville there in that general area. But Fort Worth had the cattle business. They had the oil business. Dallas was big in retail initially, before it diversified. Dallas had some of those most fantastic families, mostly all Jewish. Now, I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of them who started stores like Sanger Brothers and A. Harris and Company, which became Sanger Harris, which is, you know, gets sold and sold and sold. Volk, Dreyfus and Son. And even if you went down along Deep Ellum and the little shops that were just individually owned, most of them were owned, started, operated by great business people in the Jewish community. So while Fort Worth grew a lot off of cattle and oil, Dallas grew a lot initially off of retail. And that was a real asset to the city. The D magazine a few years ago ran an article. If you're a computer digger, you ought to get in there and find it and read it. It's probably 6 or 8 pages long. And when you read about all the people who had jobs like president of Republic National Bank and whatnot, who came out of that same community, it's fantastic. So the oil business, the cattle business, the retail business, for those of you who've not spent 76 years here like I have, Tom has been on the planet the same period of time, but not all in Dallas, so he knows a lot about Chicago that I don't know. But Dallas is a wonderful place, and to hear a story about a founding, prosperous to the community person like Sid Richardson and his descending nephews is really something. It tells you something that a lot of times you just hear it briefly referred to in a news article somewhere and it don't mean too much. But hearing him tonight, and I'm sure the information he has additionally in his book would be very informative and worth reading. So thanks again so much for coming tonight, and thank you, Jim, for coming and giving us a great presentation. I liked it.
Back in the mid-90s, I developed a friendship with a retired head of the Los Angeles FBI, Mr. Ted Gunderson. And I was hoping Jim could hear me back there, because this is our well, kind of the rebuttal period, but what we hope for is we hope to get some comments from you on the back end of this when you come back to the mic. So hopefully you can hear me okay. Ted Gunderson was hired by the Murchison family to manage an estate. Apparently, all I knew, I got to go visit the place, but I don't know the lady's name, but we called her Old Lady Linthicum. And this was one of the Murchison family. And she had passed away, and some of the younger Murchisons were going in there and taking the objects of art out of her multi-million-dollar estate there. And it was creating a political problem. Of course, she didn't want the police in there. So they pulled in Ted Gunderson to do security for the estate until they could get everything cataloged and process it correctly through the probate or whatever. And so Ted was staying there for several weeks while this was all going on. And I got to know the maid for Lady Linthicum had been at the Murchisons that fateful evening of November 21st, 1963, when they had a big party there. And May was an Irish lady-in-waiting. She had tried out to become a nun early in her life, and it just didn't quite suit her, and she ended up becoming a lady-in-waiting in service industry. And so she had been with Lady Linthicum through to when Lady Linthicum passed. So she was there with the Murchisons that evening, and she met a lot of the people there who, trying to remember what the gal's name was. LBJ had a mistress. I think her last name was Madeline Brown. That's there we go, Madeline Brown. And Madeline Brown had some wild stories about that evening. May confirmed some of that. She said there were some very prominent people there, and among those were Richard Nixon and one gentleman who went by the name Bulldog, who people believed was J. Edgar Hoover. So there were a lot of people gathering there the evening before Kennedy was assassinated here in Dallas. And I've had people accuse Dallas of assassinating JFK and like somehow or other the atmosphere here in Dallas was what killed him. And I would say there was a lot of atmosphere there at the Murchison party that was not local. And so I don't know, that kind of opens up a little bit different aspect here, and I don't know how that connects with what Jim has been telling us, but if he can connect it in and enlighten us on any of that, I'd be happy to hear it. Tom.
Well, I can make a couple of comments. As far as the cattle business in Fort Worth, my brother-in-law's father, who was a very nice man, Les Flowers, and his partner owned a ranch down in South Texas near the border that was 15,000 acres, and another over in the coastal area that was 100,000, and then another one in Mexico that was 100,000 acres. And he used to drive on horseback herds of cattle all the way from South Texas up to Fort Worth. And this is not too many years ago. With all the roads today, you couldn't do that, of course. And I know a little bit about this crazy water crystal story because I used to date one of the, probably granddaughter of that original Collins, and at a party met Jim Collins, the congressman, one time, and got invited over to the Dallas Country Club for dinner several times with her mother and her and so forth. So it was interesting. The first radio broadcast of those crazy water crystals, from what they told me, he came driving to Dallas because the radio station, I guess, was in Dallas, with a whole load of those crazy water crystals to sell, and everything was sold out by the time he got to Dallas, and that really kicked off a fortune for them. And pretty soon the family went into banking. I think they still own several banks and got into quite an interesting bit of things in the Dallas area.
Well, as those of you who are regulars know, frequently I abstain from talking. It's not that I don't like to, but as I've told Tom, as long as there are people asking good questions and people making good comments, you know, I try to zip my lip and be quiet. I'll just give you one little word of color to go along with the story on the crystals. I worked there in the Fidelity Union Life Insurance Company building complex, 2 buildings that Carr Collins and his company built, and I was blessed. It was a nothing job while I was going to college, but fortunately, my boss was the general counsel of the company, and he had me do some things that normally you would never think about doing as a part-timer. In fact, he had me do a lot of things that you'd be lucky if you got to do when you were 10 years out of college. Well, I spent about an hour every Saturday morning with Carr Collins Sr. and got acquainted with Junior and Charles Sharp, who died at an early age. His ex-wife is Ruth Collins Altschuler, who most of you in this room know. She's probably 90 years old now, and a wonderful lady and a very generous contributor to Dallas community. But with Crazy Water Crystals, that had all shut down. The hotel was closed, and Mineral Wells was just sort of almost a blowing dust ball out there in the West Texas desert west of Fort Worth, about an hour. And Carr got some of us one day to go over there and find the boxes that had all of the subscription lists on index cards for people who bought Crazy Water Crystals. My word, when they sent out that initial mailing, you could never have advertised anything like that and got this kind of response. It just poured in. People, I read those letters, I'd fall out of my chair sometimes laughing. they'd tell all kinds of tales about, I took my crazy water crystals, you could just hear them, you know, and such and so happened to me or never happened again. Please send me some, you know. So it was an interesting experience to see some history out of the past, which I love history, and see it brought back to life again, and people jumped out of the woodwork that nobody knew if they were even still alive again. Said, please send us our product. We love it. Wouldn't you like to be selling that kind of merchandise today? Oh, gee. Pure color.
Well, some years back, I had some friends out in Odessa area, and one of the things going on, I don't remember exactly what year we're talking about right now, but Royal Dutch Shell was shutting down. A lot of the big refineries out there were all closing up shop. Royal Dutch Shell did something that some people were finding unusual. They cut their vessel. They had a lot of equipment there that could have been sold for maybe $100 million on a resale market, and they just destroyed it. And right in the middle of that, had a little company coming in and buying up the old Fina refinery, a little company by the name of Alon.
Big Spring.
And Big Spring, yeah. And so it had a lot of people puzzled as to what was going on. Now, back at College of Complexes a little while ago, we used to be meeting over at the Mecca restaurant, and a petroleum geologist came to one of those meetings that was held over there. And I think he came to a couple of different meetings. And so some conversation came up, and he shared some charts. This is satellite down-looking radar on the Permian Basin. And he was describing different things there and showing the shading in different colors and oil deposits at different depths and salt deposit, all this kind of stuff out there, and it's all showing up on this map. And that kind of explains that, in fact, the Permian Basin wasn't played out at all. Maybe they'd had some wells run down, they weren't producing what they used to, but then a couple years back I was hearing you could barely get a motel room out there. That rooms were going for $400, $600 a night, and there was a lot of new production, and I was just very much on the quiet. And if Jim knows anything about any of the current events out there, I'd be happy to hear that too.
Anyway, I guess I'm the last one standing, so everybody's had opportunity here to come up here and comment on what Jim's had to say. I want to thank our speaker for doing a great job here tonight. I thought he did a terrific job, Jim Gatewood.
Congratulate Tom.
Congratulate who?
You,
Why?
on the 6-hour day.
A 6-hour day.
That's made, it's real. In
Oh.
Sweden.
Yeah, it's in Sweden now. They're Anyway, I want to thank our speaker for being here tonight. I think he did a terrific job. He kept us all on our toes. He was very interesting and very much in depth. And he is a I don't know what the word is. He's a relic, and he's really good.
That is not the word.
Not the word. Not the relic is not the word. He's well. What is the word then?
A master, a wordsmith.
A wordsmith. There we are.
A fine sculptor of words.
A sculptor of words.
Historian.
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 A true genius. Anyway,
A treasure.
a treasure. That's it. A treasure. You got it. All right. Well, anyway, our speaker, Jim, you get the last word now. As you come up here and say whatever you want and finish us off. So come on up here.
Thank you, Tom. I always enjoy this group. Last time I talked to you, I talked about M.T. Gonzalez and how his two older brothers were killed by Pancho Villa. And as a small 8-year-old boy, he swore a vendetta against Pancho Villa and all his men. 23 years later, he buried Pancho Villa's head at the foot of his brother's grave. And he killed 152 of Pancho Villa's men. Great story. Just laying there, it was never going to get published. I'm so glad that I had the opportunity. I want to thank you, and Tom, anytime you have a cancellation or need somebody, give me a shout. I've got 9 books and I'm working on number 10.
Yeah, we have our lunch, or we did, yeah, you'll be back. Good.
Well, that's it for tonight. They kick us out of here at 10:30, just so you know. And our speaker is back there. You can talk to him. He has some books. He has the book on Sid Richardson if you want to buy one. And we certainly want to help him anyway. See you all next week. Or next week. No, not next week. 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks from now. Next week is no meeting because they're moving this place. So 2 weeks from now, we'll meet at 7033 Greenville. It's on the west side of the street, 2.5 blocks south. It's south of the 2 gas stations, about a block north of Twin Oaks, if you know where that is. Twin Oaks is the first light north of Park Avenue. So 1 block north, it's on the west side of the street. It's across the street from O'Reilly's. It might help you. Anyway, see you all next week, or 2 weeks.